check your breakfast, sir." Those 4 words shattered the absolute silence of the Duca estate. Murphy Moretti froze before his fork could touch the plate. He did not believe in coincidence. He did not believe in accidents. In his world, a word out of place was usually a death sentence. Murphy stared down at the table. The silver tray gleamed under the morning light. The eggs were cooked to a precise minute. The coffee was replaced by a steaming cup of herbal tea just as he requested. Everything looked normal. Everything looked safe. Yet, a 3-year-old girl stood barefoot on the marble floor. Her name was Lily. She wore a faded yellow nightgown and clutched a worn, one-eared stuffed rabbit. Her dark eyes were fixed entirely on his breakfast plate. Not on him. Not on the heavily armed guards stationed outside the glass doors. Just the food. "It smells like Papa's medicine," Lily whispered. The air in the grand dining hall turned to ice. Murphy slowly lowered his hand. "What did you say?" His voice was barely a murmur, yet it carried the weight of a loaded gun. Lily shrank back half a step, hiding behind her mother's trembling legs. Her mother was Allie Carter, a new housekeeper hired just 8 months ago. Allie dropped to her knees, her face completely drained of color. "Mr. Moretti, I am so sorry," Allie sobbed, her hands gripping the hem of her apron. "She shouldn't be here. I had no one to watch her today. I'll take her away right now." Murphy did not look at Allie. His gaze remained locked on the child. 16 years ago, Murphy's father had died at this exact desk of a sudden heart attack. The official report called it natural causes. Murphy had known it was poison from day one. He had spent 16 years building a fortress of steel, blood, and absolute paranoia. No outsider could get within a mile of his estate. No food entered his mouth without passing 3 separate tests. And yet, a toddler had just smelled death in his morning meal. "Mateo," Murphy spoke without turning his head. From the shadows beside the mahogany door, his head of security materialized. Mateo Ricci stepped forward with a hard black case in his hand. Without a single word, Mateo crossed the room. He drew a sterile pipette from the case. He extracted a drop of liquid from the teacup and a small sample from the side dish. The entire staff of the kitchen stood frozen against the far wall. Danny, the young cook who had prepared the meal 3 minutes ago, was shaking so violently his knees knocked together. 10 minutes passed in absolute suffocating silence. Only the ticking of the antique grandfather clock broke the tension. Mateo inserted the test strip into the portable digital reader. The screen flashed red. Mateo looked up, his eyes turning to lethal steel. "Cyanide derivative, sir." Mateo's voice was a low growl. "Colorless, odorless, custom engineered in a private lab. A single dose won't kill instantly, but a tiny amount every morning mimics a rapid organ failure. In 3 weeks, the autopsy would call it natural causes." Murphy stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the marble floor like a scream. The illusion of his impenetrable fortress shattered in a single second. The poison wasn't brought by an enemy at the gates. It was cooked in his own kitchen. It was served by his own trusted staff. Murphy turned his cold, unblinking gaze toward the young cook. "Danny," Murphy said softly, "did you make this?" Danny collapsed onto his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know," Danny screamed, pressing his palms against the floor. "A man approached me 3 months ago. He gave me cash for my brother's medical bills. He told me it was just a sedative to help you sleep better during negotiations. I swear on my mother's life I didn't know it was poison." "Who?" Murphy asked, stepping closer. I don't know his name, Danny sobbed. Dead drops, locker keys at the central station. I never met the real boss. Murphy stopped in front of the kneeling cook. There was no rage in Murphy's eyes, just a terrifying, bottomless void. You didn't know, Murphy repeated. He pulled a 9mm pistol from his shoulder holster with casual fluidity. Before anyone could blink, the barrel pressed against Danny's forehead. Sir, wait, Mateo warned quietly. He might be a dead end, but we can trace the locker. I don't need a locker, Murphy replied. I need a message. The gunshot echoed through the high ceilings of the estate. Danny slumped forward, the dark stain spreading rapidly across the white marble. Allie screamed, pulling Riley's face into her chest so the child could not see the blood. Murphy didn't even flinch. He slid the smoking weapon back into his holster. He looked down at Allie and the trembling little girl. You, Murphy said, pointing a finger at the housekeeper. Get up. Allie scrambled to her feet, her whole body trembling. You said your husband died, Murphy stated, recalling the frantic words she muttered in her panic. How did a simple housekeeper know what custom-made poison smells like? Allie bit her lower lip, her eyes wide with terror. She knew she was standing on the edge of a cliff. If she lied, she died. If she told the truth, she opened a door to a war she had spent 3 years running from. My husband was Marco Rossi, Allie whispered, the confession tearing out of her throat. He was the chief accountant for Victoria Romano. The room went dead silent again. The name dropped like a tactical nuke. Victoria Romano, the supreme crime lord of the rival territory, a man who had maintained a tense, armed truce with the Duca family for a decade. Romano, Murphy murmured, tasting the name on his tongue like poison. Marco found out what Victoria was doing, Allie continued rapidly, desperate to stay alive. Money laundering, bought judges, and a list of sleeper agents planted inside every major Mafia family in the city. Murphy's eyes narrowed. Sleeper agents? Yes, Allie nodded, tears spilling over her lashes. Marco was poisoned the exact same way. 7 months of slow decay. Before he died, he copied the master drive and told me to run. I spent 3 years hiding, changing my name, running from city to city, until I had no choice but to take a job here. Why here? Murphy demanded. Of all the places on earth, why walk into the lion's den? Because I knew you were the only man powerful enough to kill Victoria Romano, Allie answered, her voice suddenly steady, fueled by a widow's pure, unadulterated vengeance. And I knew my husband's drive was the weapon you needed. Murphy stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He processed the data with the cold precision of a supercomputer. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. The recent probes at the docks, the subtle shifts in territory. Romano wasn't just planning a war. Romano was planning a takeover from the inside. And the list of sleeper agents. The list that contained traitors hidden within the Duca family itself. Where is the drive, Allie? Murphy asked. Safe, she replied. Hidden in a place no one will ever find, unless I give the coordinates. Murphy turned away from her and looked out the massive glass window toward the east gardens. The sun was fully up now, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured hedges. His fortress had been breached, His breakfast had been weaponized. A traitor was sitting at his table, smiling in his face every single day. And the only reason he was still breathing was because a 3-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit decided to speak up. Murphy turned back to Matteo. "Lock down the estate," Murphy ordered, his voice cutting through the lingering scent of gunpowder. "No one enters, no one leaves. Find out who recommended Danny for this job 3 months ago." "Already on it, sir." Matteo nodded. Murphy looked down at little Lily. The child peeked out from behind her mother's apron, no longer crying, her big, dark eyes staring up at the terrifying Mafia boss. Slowly, awkwardly, Murphy reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, wrapped mint candy, something he kept for emergencies, and held it out toward her. Lily blinked, stepped forward, and tiny fingers brushed against his leather-gloved hand to tip the candy. "Good job, Piccola," Murphy muttered, the roughness in his voice softening just a fraction. He looked back at Allie. "You and your daughter are staying in the guest wing under armed guard," Murphy commanded. "From this second on, you belong to me." He walked past them toward the heavy double doors of the study. The war had finally arrived, and Victoria Romano had no idea what kind of monster he had just awakened. The air inside the guest room was thick and heavy. Allie sat quietly on the edge of the mattress. Little Lily was already fast asleep, clutching her worn, one-eared stuffed rabbit against her chest. The heavy wooden door slid open without a single sound. Murphy stepped inside the room. He had removed his blood-stained tactical jacket. His dark shirt emphasized the cold, rigid lines of his frame. "Where is the drive?" Murphy asked, cutting straight to the point. Allie raised her chin, meeting his piercing gaze directly. "In a safe place," Allie answered, her voice low and raspy. "If I die, or if you betray me, no one will ever unlock it." Murphy let out a cold, humorless laugh. "You are in no position to bargain with me, Allie, but I can give you the exact vengeance you crave." Allie gritted her teeth, a fierce and desperate light burning in her eyes. Before Marco died, he spent an entire year hacking Romano's encrypted network. The drive contains more than just financial ledgers. It holds a comprehensive index of sleeper agents planted inside every major mafia family in the city. And one of those names belongs right here, inside the core circle of the Duca family. Murphy's eyes narrowed instantly. 16 years of institutional paranoia crystallized into pure, lethal intent. A traitor? Yes, Allie inhaled sharply. Marco referred to that mole as the Watchmaker, because he possesses infinite patience, never striking blindly, but slowly winding the mechanism until the host completely collapses from within. Murphy turned away, his boots thudding softly against the floorboards. He walked up to the tall glass window, staring out into the pitch-black estate grounds. Danny was merely a disposable pawn. The real mole possesses the clearance to access my morning routine and slip poison directly into the kitchen. Furthermore, that person holds the authority to handpick new staff. Murphy's voice carried the temperature of frozen iron. Matteo is currently reviewing the employment recommendations from 3 months ago. Save him the trouble, Murphy stated, turning back slowly. The paper trail will only lead to a dead end or a flawless fake identity. Allie's heart dropped heavily into her chest. Then what is your plan? We play along, Murphy declared, dropping the words like lead weights. Since the Watchmaker believes the poison successfully reached its target, I shall fulfill his expectations. Starting tomorrow morning, I will manifest the symptoms of slow, chronic poisoning. I will cough during high-level meetings, cancel public appearances, and summon private physicians. I need that traitor to believe victory is already within their grasp. Allie drew a sharp breath of disbelief. That is an extraordinarily dangerous game. That is a lethal compound, ingested daily in trace amounts if your calculations fail even slightly. In my world, absolute safety does not exist. There is only absolute control, Murphy interrupted her flatly. If you wish to drag a venomous snake out from the dark, you must convince it that you are entirely helpless. Murphy reached the doorway and paused in his tracks. Keep your daughter safe. From this moment onward, everyone inside this estate is performing a role, including you. The door clicked shut behind him. Allie slumped back onto the edge of the bed, utterly drained. She stared down at her sleeping daughter, a piercing wave of terror crawling up her spine. She had genuinely believed she escaped the jaws of the tiger. Instead, she had willingly stepped inside a far more massive slaughterhouse. Down in the subterranean surveillance bunker, Mateo stared silently at the glowing red nodes on the tactical map. 16 years of absolute trust was being torn apart thread by thread in the dark. The digital clock on the console ticked forward. Every second brought them closer to the inevitable collision. Murphy walked down the dimly lit hallway toward his private study. His mind was a frictionless engine processing tactical variables. If Ricardo Moretti, or whoever held the Watchmaker title, was waiting for him to wither away, they would find themselves staring down the barrel of an ambush. The financial records on the drive were the key to unmasking the entire conspiracy. But first, the snake had to poke its head out of the grass. Upstairs, Lily stirred in her sleep, whimpering softly before wrapping her tiny arms tighter around her gray rabbit. Allie stroked her daughter's dark curls, whispering silent prayers to a god she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. The Duca estate looked like a fortress of absolute tranquility from the outside. Beneath the surface, the gears of a brutal, unyielding war had started to turn. Murphy sat at his heavy oak desk in total darkness. He did not turn on the lamp. He simply waited for the dawn, knowing that every breath he took from now on was part of a deadly performance. The Watchmaker was wiving the clock, and Murphy was going to break every single gear inside it. The estate remained outwardly calm. To the outside world, the Duca compound was a monument to absolute stillness. Guards rotated at dawn with clockwork precision. Heavy iron gates opened only twice a day. Yet beneath the polished marble and pristine white stucco, a silent theater of deception had commenced. Murphy's simulated symptoms began precisely on schedule, engineered with the ruthless efficiency of a master tactician. During the morning briefing in the grand strategy room, a sudden, violent fit of coughing racked his frame. His hand rose to cover his mouth, a handkerchief caught flashing white against his dark knuckles. He dismissed his senior capos early with a wave of his hand, his voice raspy and controlled. His skin took on a pale, carefully managed pallor, achieved through long hours under low light and a deliberate reduction in heavy physical training. In the shadows of the West Wing, the invisible watcher smiled. The mechanism was winding down. The poison was doing its work. The watchmaker sat in his private office reviewing routine supply requisitions, completely unaware that his target was orchestrating a grand theatrical illusion. Every cough was calculated. Every cancelled meeting was a deliberate breadcrumb dropped down the path of overconfidence. Inside the secure operations room deep beneath the east wing, the air smelled of stale coffee and hot electronics. Financial ledgers spanned 11 years of shadow banking, complex corporate layers, and offshore tax evasion. Allie stood beside the tactical desk, her knuckles white against the edge of the steel surface. Her eyes scanned the Zurich shell account traces her husband, Marco, had left behind, cross-referencing numbers that had cost a man his life. "Look at this timestamp." Allie pointed a tremble finger at the glowing monitor. 11 years ago, right before the old boss died. The exact same offshore entity funded this account. Matteo's scarred face tightened into a mask of pure ice. His arms were crossed over his broad chest, his dark eyes locked on the scrolling lines of code and transaction receipts. The watchmaker. Matteo muttered the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. He didn't just infiltrate the family yesterday. He was already inside when the patriarch was murdered. The realization sent a freezing current through the small, sterile room. The murder of Giovanni Duca 16 years ago had never been solved. The official records pointed to a sudden cardiac arrest in a room locked from the inside. But now, looking at the financial fingerprints stretching backward across the decade, the truth reared its ugly head. The man who killed the father had spent 16 years whispering advice into the ear of the son. Upstairs in the private family quarters, the war felt a million miles away, locked behind heavy oak doors and armed guards. Murphy sat on the Persian rug in the west sitting room, his jacket discarded over the back of a velvet armchair. Lily squatted in front of him on the intricate geometric patterns of the carpet. She held a red wooden block with intense concentration, her tongue slightly protruding from the corner of her mouth. "This goes here," Lily declared, her voice filled with small child solemnity. She placed the block on top of a wobbly, precarious tower of colored timber. "Are you sure?" Murphy asked, looking down at the fragile structure. His deep voice carried a rare, gentle cadence that no living soul outside these walls had ever heard. 100% sure, the 3-year-old nodded solemnly, her dark curls bouncing with the movement. The tower collapsed with a soft, dry clatter, scattering blocks across the expensive rug. Lily giggled. It was an unbridled musical sound that echoed through the high-ceilinged marble halls. Murphy looked down at the tiny fingers resting on his knee, tiny hands that knew nothing of blood, betrayal, or poison. For 16 years, he had believed safety lived behind thick walls, reinforced steel doors, and loaded weapons. He had built an emotional vacuum, convinced that isolation was armor. Now, looking into a child's dark and fearless eyes, he realized how hollow his fortress truly was. His empire was vast, but his life had been a graveyard. From the doorway of the sitting room, Allie watched the scene unfold in silence. Her chest tightened with a strange, terrifying warmth that felt almost painful in its intensity. She had come here seeking vengeance for Marco, driven by the cold fuel of widowhood and grief. She had never expected to find a sanctuary inside the jaws of the beast, let alone watch the most feared man in the city building block towers with her daughter. Down in the East Wing office, the financial audit reached its inevitable, brutal conclusion. Matteo cross-referenced the final Shell Corporation signature with the internal HR records, matching signatures, ink types, and notary stamps. Only one name matched every single data point without a single statistical anomaly. The financial advisor who had stood beside Murphy through every crisis for 16 years, Ricardo Moretti. The trap was fully closed. The web was spun. Now, they only had to wait for the Watchmaker to make his final, fatal move. The trap broke on the 12th day. Not through brilliance, through a nothing. A junior accountant on Matteo's financial team requested an archived Zurich record through the wrong clerk. A clerk who owed Ricardo Moretti a favor and mentioned it over a casual lunch. A single sentence. A tiny sliver of light under a reinforced steel door. Watchmakers noticed slivers. That evening, Ricardo Moretti ran a quiet test of his own. He planted a false financial detail in a routine report. He watched it surface hours later in a bracing question from one of Matteo's men. In that instant, sitting alone in his private office with his heart turning to stone, Ricardo understood everything. The convenient illness, the perfect schedule of symptoms. He wasn't watching a mechanism collapse. He was inside one. The call he made lasted precisely 40 seconds. Across the city in a fortified villa, Victoria Romano listened to the report. He set down his glass of vintage wine. He made the decision he had prepared for 10 years. No more patience. No more poison. Fire. It was 2:47 in the morning when the first perimeter alarm shrieked. Murphy was awake before the second tone sounded. Boots thudded against the hallway floorboards. Matteo's voice crackled over the secure radio, clipped and freezing. Perimeter breach. South wall. Multiple heavy vehicles. Then the east gate. Then the service road. This wasn't a probe. This wasn't a warning message. It was an invading army. The main electrical grid died all at once. The estate plunged into absolute darkness for 3 heartbeats. Then the backup diesel generators coughed, flooding the hallways with a dim, emergency gold glow. Somewhere below, reinforced glass shattered. The night erupted with the thunder of automatic gunfire. First in sharp bursts, then rolling into a wall of pure sound. Muzzle flashes stuttered across the east garden, where Murphy used to drink his morning espresso in peace. Full defense, Murphy ordered into the radio. He was already moving, already locking his tactical vest, already armed. Hold the main house, Matteo. Secure the guest wing now. Down the damp service corridor, Allie was already on her feet. She held Lily tightly in her arms before the guards even reached her door. 3 years of running compressed into pure desperate reflex. The worn-out gray rabbit. The emergency go bag. The child's face pressed hard into her shoulder. "Mama, what's that loud noise?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay with me, my love," Allie breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. 2 Duca guards in black tactical gear appeared at the end of the hall. "This way, Mrs. Carter," the lead guard barked, raising his rifle. "We are moving you to the lower-level safe room." They flanked her rapidly down the concrete service stairwell. Above them, the mansions tendered under the weight of an assault. Allie ran, her breath burning in her throat. The steel door of the underground shelter loomed ahead in the half-light. It was open, waiting. And at the threshold, a small, ice-cold detail snagged at the edge of Allie's awareness. The exact same wrong feeling her daughter had experienced in the kitchen. She knew the estate guards. She watched their rotations for 8 months. She had never seen these two men in her life. The steel door swung wider. The taller guard smiled at her, a little too easily. "After you, Mrs. Rossi," the guard said smoothly. Allie stopped dead in her tracks. She had never told a single soul in this house her real married name. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. These weren't Duca guards. They were Romano's men, wearing stolen uniforms, guided by the internal traitor who knew every code in the building. "Mama," Lily whimpered, sensing the sudden terror radiating from her mother's body. "Run," Allie whispered, her voice cracking as she pushed the child back into the shadowy corridor. The taller fake guard's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory snarling. He lunged forward, grabbing Allie by the arm before she could retreat. "You're not going anywhere, Mrs. Rossi," the man hissed, yanking her toward the open threshold of the safe room. Allie screamed, her fingernails scraping against the concrete floor as she fought with the desperate strength of a mother facing absolute doom. "Get away from me," she cried out, kicking backward and connecting hard with the guard's shin. The man grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. "Grab the kid," the second guard shouted, lunging past his partner toward little Lily. Lily shrieked, clutching her gray rabbit to her chest as she stumbled backward against the damp wall. "No!" Allie roared, breaking free from the first guard's grasp and throwing herself between the armed man and her daughter. The heavy butt of an assault rifle came down hard across Allie's shoulder blade. The impact sent a sickening jolt of pain through her entire body, dropping her to her knees. The world spun violently for a moment. Dark spots danced across her vision. "Mama!" Lily wailed, running forward to wrap her tiny arms around Allie's neck. The tall guard towered over them, his face twisted in cruel impatience. He holstered his weapon, pulled heavy plastic zip ties from his tactical belt, and hauled Allie roughly to her feet. "Enough of this game," the guard snarled, binding her wrists behind her back with brutal efficiency. He grabbed Allie by the collar, dragging her into the concrete vault of the safe room, while his partner scooped a sobbing Lily into his arms. The steel doors slammed shut behind them with a heavy, final thud. The internal locking mechanism clicked into place, sealing them inside a tomb of gray concrete and flickering emergency lights. Outside, the distant roar of gunfire continued to shake the foundation of the estate. Murphy and his men were still fighting for the upper levels, completely unaware that the primary objective of the raid had already fallen into the enemy's hands. Allie slumped against the cold wall, blood trickling from a split lip, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. She looked down at her daughter, who was trembling uncontrollably in the corner of the concrete cell. "I'm sorry, my baby," Allie whispered, hot tears finally breaking free and cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I'm so sorry." "Will the big man save us, Mama?" Lily asked softly, her big dark eyes filled with absolute heartbreaking trust. "He'll come," Allie said, her voice steadying against the rising tide of despair as she thought of the cold, lethal gaze of Murphy Moretti. "He always comes." In the control room upstairs, Matteo stared at a single blinking red light on his console. The secondary safe room override had just been triggered from the inside. A cold sweat broke out across Matteo's scarred forehead. He grabbed his radio, his voice cutting through the chaos of battle like a razor blade. "Boss," Matteo yelled over the gunfire. "The safe room has been compromised. They have Allie and the girl." A terrible, suffocating silence hummed across the radio channel for 2 full seconds. Then Murphy's voice came back. It wasn't loud. It wasn't panicked. It was the cold, quiet sound of an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. "And the defense, Matteo," Murphy commanded, the absolute fury in his tune freezing the blood in every guard's veins. "Burn the outer gates. We are going hunting." The heavy steel door of the underground safe room locked shut with a deafening metallic echo. Allie fell hard against the cold concrete floor. Her wrists throbbed from the tight plastic zip ties. Blood trickled from her split lip, staining the dust beneath her knees. Lily wailed in absolute terror, scrambling across the rough surface to throw her tiny arms around her mother's neck. Mama, don't close your eyes," the little girl cried, her voice tearing at Allie's soul. "I'm here, my sweet baby. I'm right here," Allie whispered through her tears. She forced her aching body to shift, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. In the dim, emergency glow of the vault, the shadows stretched like skeletal fingers. Outside, the heavy steel door, muffled footsteps echoed down the concrete corridor. The fake guards had vanished into the smoke and chaos of the upper levels. They had delivered their prize, and now the trap had fully snapped shut. Up in the main operations center, Matteo slammed his fist against the reinforced steel console. The red, blinking light on the tactical map mocked him. "Sir, the secondary override code was used from an internal terminal," Matteo reported, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "Ricardo Moretti had the access codes. He sold every security protocol we spent 16 years building." Murphy Moretti stood in the center of the dark room. He did not shout. He did not smash the monitors. Absolute stillness radiated from his frame, the terrifying calm before a Category 5 hurricane. He reached down to his tactical belt, locking a fresh magazine into his assault rifle with a sharp, metallic click. "End the defensive posture, Matteo," Murphy commanded, his voice dropping to a deadly, glacial whisper. "Burn the outer gates. Open every armory. We are going hunting." Matteo looked up, seeing the cold fire burning in his boss's eyes. For 18 years of service, Matteo had never seen Murphy look like this. This wasn't a tactical counterattack. This was a total, unadulterated extermination protocol. "All teams, move out," Matteo barked into his comms. Within 90 minutes, the Duca estate was transformed from a besieged fortress into a staging ground for war. Armored black SUVs idled in the main courtyard, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn drizzle. Dozens of elite operatives checked their gear in absolute silence. Murphy walked out of the main entrance, his heavy combat boots crunching over shattered glass and spent shell casings. He reached inside his tactical jacket. His fingers brushed against a small, soft object. The gray, one-eared stuffed rabbit that Lily had dropped in the hallway during the struggle. Murphy pulled it out, staring at the worn fabric for a fraction of a second. Then he slid it safely into his inner pocket, right over his heart. He climbed into the lead vehicle, slamming the heavy door shut. "Where to, boss?" Matteo asked from the driver's seat, his hands steady on the steering wheel. "The river flats," Murphy replied, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "The abandoned cannery complex. Marco's hard drive had the property codes. Romano thinks he's hiding a hostage. He has no idea what he just invited into his house." Across the city, inside a massive, rusted concrete warehouse overlooking the dark river, Victoria Romano sat in a metal chair. A bottle of expensive whiskey rested on a wooden crate beside him. Across the cavernous room, bound securely to a heavy wooden chair, was Allie Carter. A strip of duct tape was clamped across her mouth, muffling her distressed cries. At her feet, little Lily sat huddled on a dirty tarp, her eyes wide with uncomprehending fear, clutching her knees tightly to her chest. Victoria stood up, smoothing the lapels of his immaculate charcoal suit. He walked slowly toward Allie, stopping just inches away. He reached out, peeling the tape roughly from her mouth. Allie gasped, a sharp cry escaping her lips. "You should have stayed hidden, Mrs. Rossi," Victoria said smoothly, a sickeningly polite smile on his face. "Your husband caused me enough trouble with those stolen ledgers. And now, you brought your little spawn straight to my doorstep. If you touch her," Allie spat, blood spraying onto the polished toe of Victoria's shoe, "Murphy Moretti will tear this city down to the bedrock." Victoria laughed softly, a low, arrogant sound that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. "Murphy Moretti is a ghost walking on borrowed time," Victoria mocked, leaning down. "Ricardo Moretti has already locked down the inner sanctum. By the time Murphy reaches this river, his entire empire will belong to me." Before Victoria could straighten up, a massive explosion shook the northern wall of the warehouse. Debris flew across the concrete floor. Alarms wailed through the industrial rafters. The heavy steel loading doors buckled under the force of a breaching charge and blew inward in a storm of white-hot sparks. Through the rolling smoke, dark silhouettes advanced with lethal precision. At the front of the formation strode Murphy Moretti. His rifle was raised. His face was carved from granite in absolute vengeance. Victoria Romano's smug smile vanished instantly. He drew his sidearm, grabbing Allie by the hair and pressing the cold barrel against her temple. "Drop your weapons," Victoria screamed over the settling dust, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Drop them or the woman dies right now." Murphy stopped 20 paces away. He lowered the barrel of his rifle just a fraction of an inch, his eyes locked onto Victoria with a terrifying predator focus. "You took the wrong child, Victoria," Murphy said quietly, his voice carrying across the empty warehouse like a death sentence. "And you sat in the wrong chair?" The warehouse air tasted like rusted iron and cordite. A thick, oily smoke hung low beneath the corrugated metal rafters, curling around dangling chains and broken light fixtures. Every breath burned the lungs with the metallic tang of spent gunpowder and industrial decay. Victoria Romano's hand shook slightly against Allie's temple. The cold steel of the heavy pistol pressed deep into her skin. The weapon felt heavy in his sweaty, trembling grip. He knew the walls were closing in. He knew his empire of shadows had just collapsed into ash. "You're dead, Murphy," Victoria screamed, his voice cracking, echoing wildly off the cavernous metal walls. "You walk another step, and her brains splatter across this floor." Murphy Moretti did not even blink. His face remained a mask of cold, unyielding granite. His heavy combat boots stepped deliberately over a shattered steel beam that blocked the concrete aisle. His assault rifle was locked, loaded, and aimed, with absolute mathematical precision straight at Victoria's chest. There was no hesitation in his stance. There was no flicker of doubt in his dark eyes. "You miscalculated everything, Victoria," Murphy said, his voice cold and devoid of human warmth. It cut through the howling wind outside like an executioner's blade. "You thought the poison broke me. You thought the safe room doors would hold against a real siege. And you trusted a rat who couldn't even hide his own financial footprints." From the shadows behind a towering stack of rusted shipping crates, a figure stumbled forward into the dim, flickering light. Ricardo Moretti. His face was ghostly pale under the grime and soot. His expensive designer suit was torn, stained with soot and fresh blood from the perimeter skirmish. He held a compact submachine gun in his shaking hands. His eyes were wide with absolute, animal panic. "Boss? Listen to me, boss," Ricardo stammered, his voice pitching high as he raised his trembling weapon toward Murphy. "It was all Victoria. He forced me. He threatened my family. Murphy stopped walking. The silence that followed was heavier than the falling warehouse roof. He slowly shifted his gaze away from Victoria Romano. He looked down the barrel of his own rifle toward the man who had stood by his side, shared his warm room, and poured his drinks for 16 years. 16 years, Ricardo, Murphy whispered. The softness in his tone was infinitely more terrifying than a roar. You poured my morning coffee. You reviewed my father's final accounts on the anniversary of his death. And you sold every soul in this family for a seat at Romano's table. Ricardo's breath hitched violently in his throat. Desperation twisted his features into something monstrous. He swept his gun barrel away from Murphy and aimed it directly at Allie and little Lily. "Stay back, Murphy," Ricardo shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "I swear to God, I'll pull the trigger and send them both to hell right now." The movement was too slow. The tactical threat assessment was already complete in Murphy's mind. The intent was entirely transparent. Before Ricardo's crooked finger could tighten on the trigger, a sharp, deafening crack echoed through the cavernous warehouse. A single 9mm round tore through the dim air with supersonic velocity. It entered Ricardo's chest precisely between his ribs with a wet, heavy thud. Ricardo froze mid-sentence. His mouth remained open in a silent gasp. The submachine gun slipped from his paralyzed fingers, clattering loudly and uselessly against the concrete floor. He looked down slowly at his own chest. A dark, spreading circle of crimson blood was rapidly soaking through his white shirt, turning the fine silk into a sodden mess. He swayed on his feet for 2 agonizing heartbeats. Then he collapsed face first onto the cold concrete, motionless. His betrayal finally buried with him. Victoria Romano panicked instantly, his grip on Allie's hair tightening with psychotic violence. "You crazy bastard!" Victoria shrieked, his eyes bulging as he swung his pistol away from Allie toward Murphy's face. Murphy did not give him the time to level the sights. Murphy fired twice in rapid succession. Bang, bang. The first round shattered Victoria's right wrist, with a sickening crunch of bone, sending his heavy pistol spinning uselessly into the dark air. The second round struck him dead center in the chest, punching clean through fabric and flesh. Victoria stumbled backward, his breath catching in a wet rattle. His eyes glazed over with shock and total disbelief. He crashed down hard beside the wooden crate, his body sliding into the dirt. Silence descended upon the warehouse once more, broken only by the steady, distant crackle of flames from the breached entrance. Allie clutched Lily tightly to her chest, her entire body shaking uncontrollably from the violent release of adrenaline and terror. Heavy combat boots thudded heavily across the floor. Matteo and the Duca strike team swarmed into the room from every angle, securing the perimeters, clearing the corners, and neutralizing the remaining mercenaries with cold efficiency. Murphy stepped forward, his boots clicking on the concrete. He knelt down slowly in front of Allie and little Lily. The harsh, lethal aura that had defined his advance vanished in an instant. It was replaced by a deep, quiet stillness, like the surface of a frozen lake. He reached out, his strong, calloused hands gently untying the tight plastic zip ties from Allie's bleeding wrists. "Are you hurt?" Murphy asked, his voice low, steady, and intensely gentle. Allie shook her head rapidly, hot tears finally spilling over her eyelashes as she looked up into his dark, unwavering eyes. "No," Allie whispered, her voice cracking and trembling. "We're safe." Murphy gently reached out and pulled Lily into his arms, lifting the little girl safely off the cold concrete floor. Lily immediately buried her face deep in the crook of his broad shoulder, clutching her worn, gray stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. "The bad men are gone, little one," Murphy murmured softly against her dark curls. "I know," Lily mumbled sleepily into his collar, her tiny arms wrapping securely around his neck. "I knew you'd come." Murphy stood up slowly, holding the child securely in one arm, while extending his other strong hand to help Allie to her feet. "Let's go home," Murphy said, turning his back on the smoking ruins of the enemy's stronghold. He led them out of the burning warehouse and into the cold, clean light of the breaking dawn. The morning sun rose over the silent city. The Duca estate stood tall against the pale sky. The scars of the midnight raid were already being erased. Broken glass had been swept from the courtyards. Shattered window panes were replaced with pristine, reinforced panes. Inside the grand strategy room, the air was cold and absolute. Murphy Moretti sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table. His dark tactical shirt was replaced by a crisp, tailored suit. Not a single trace of the previous night's violence remained on his skin. Only the cold, dead stillness in his eyes betrayed the war he had just won. Matteo stood beside the desk, sliding a thick, leather-bound dossier across the polished wood. "The cleanup is finished," Matteo reported, his voice low and steady. "Every sleeper agent planted by Victoria Romano has been rooted out. The remaining assets in the downtown syndicate have surrendered their territories. The Duca family's control is absolute once more." Murphy opened the dossier. Inside were the names, photos, and financial trails of every traitor. The Watchmaker's network was completely dismantled, piece by piece. Not a single gear remained turning in the enemy's machine. "What about the accounts?" Murphy asked, not looking up from the pages. "Frozen and recovered," Matteo replied. "Marco's digital drive has been integrated into our secure servers. Romano's entire laundering operation now feeds the Duca empire." Murphy closed the folder with a sharp, echoing snap. "Good. Leave me." Matteo nodded silently, turning on his heel and exiting the grand room without another word. Heavy oak doors clicked shut. Silence reclaimed the cavernous space. Upstairs in the private family wing, the sunlight streamed warmly through the high windows. Allie sat by the edge of the velvet armchair in the west suite. Her wrists were no longer bound. The minor bruises from the safe room had begun to fade. Little Lily was curled up fast asleep on the oversized sofa, clutching her worn, one-eared stuffed rabbit against her chest. The terrifying screams of the night raid felt like a lifetime away. Yet the reality of where they were, and who protected them, remained heavier than ever. The door swung open silently. Murphy stepped into the room. He removed his suit jacket, tossing it casually over a chair. He walked quietly across the thick Persian rug, stopping a few feet away from Allie. Allie looked up, meeting his piercing, dark gaze without flinching. "You're safe," Murphy said, his voice dropping to a quiet, resonant register meant only for her ears. "The Romano name is finished in this city. No one will ever hunt you or your daughter again." Allie let out a long, rapid breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 years. "I thought we were going to die in that warehouse," Allie confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't," Murphy replied immediately, his tone absolute. "Because you belong to this house now." Allie stood up slowly, facing the most feared man in the underground world. "And what happens now, Murphy? Do we go back to being strangers, playing roles behind iron gates?" Murphy stepped closer. The cold, lethal predator of the previous night was entirely gone. In his place stood a man who had finally torn down his own walls. There are no more roles, Allie, Murphy said softly, reaching out to gently touch a lock of dark hair falling across her shoulder. The Watchmaker is dead. The war is over, and my home is no longer empty. Allie's heart skipped a beat as she looked into his eyes, finding a rare, profound warmth that bridged the chasm between their brutal worlds. From the sofa, little Lily stirred, letting out a soft yawn before rubbing her sleepy eyes. She looked up, seeing Murphy and Allie standing close together. A wide, gap-toothed smile spread across the little girl's face. "Big man," Lily mumbled, holding her stuffed rabbit up in the air. "Can we play block towers again?" Murphy looked down at the child, a faint, genuine smile breaking across his rigid face for the first time in 16 years. "Always," Murphy answered. He scooped Lily up into his arms, pulling her close, while wrapping his other arms securely around Allie's waist. The fortress of iron and blood had finally become a home. The iron gates of the Duca estate swung open wide. The heavy steel panels moved without a single squeak. Morning sunlight poured over the manicured lawns. Golden rays stretched across the pristine white stucco. No shadows lingered in the corners of the compound. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh-cut grass. Inside the private study, the heavy oak desk was cleared. Tactical maps had vanished. Weapon schematics were locked away. Only family portraits and financial ledgers remained on the polished wood. Murphy Moretti sat alone in the leather armchair. His posture was relaxed. The defensive tension that had defined his life for 16 years was completely gone. The war against Victoria Romano was a fading memory. The blood of the traitors had washed clean into the city's drainage. Silence wrapped around the room like a warm cloak. Mateo stepped into the study without knocking. His scarred face carried a rare, quiet expression of relief. The lines of constant worry around his eyes had smoothed away. "The final syndicate heads have signed the treaties, boss," Mateo reported. His voice was steady and absolute. No resistance, no counter-offers. "The city knows who holds the crown." Murphy nodded slowly. His dark eyes were fixed on the silver pen resting on the leather blotter. "Keep the port secure, Mateo," Murphy instructed. "And double the perimeter rotations." "Not because we are hunted," Murphy added, his voice dropping to a quiet register. "Because we have something worth protecting now." Mateo offered a brief, respectful nod. He turned on his heel and retreated from the room without another word. Upstairs in the West Suite, the atmosphere was filled with a quiet, unyielding warmth. Allie stood by the tall glass window. She looked out over the peaceful gardens where the morning dew glittered on the leaves. The constant terror of running had finally faded from her bones. She no longer checked the locks every 10 minutes. She no longer looked over her shoulder in crowded rooms or flinched at sudden sounds. The ghost of her past life had been laid to rest. Little Lily sat on the thick Persian carpet near the sofa. She rested her hand directly over Murphy's strong fingers. The broken pieces of their separate, violent pasts had finally locked into place. The Iron Fortress was no longer a cage of isolation. It was a sanctuary built on trust and blood. Outside, a gentle wind whispered through the estate's high iron gates. Inside, the world was entirely at peace. The morning light painted the eastern sky in breathtaking shades of liquid gold and soft rose. A cool, crisp dawn breeze swept across the meticulously manicured lawns of the Duca estate. The sprawling compound stood as a magnificent monument to absolute, unyielding peace. Not a single shadow lingered along the high perimeter walls. The heavy iron gates stood wide open to welcome the bright new day. Inside the grand master suite, the heavy velvet curtains were pulled completely back. Brilliant sunlight flooded across the polished hardwood floors. Murphy Moretti stood silently by the wide floor-to-ceiling window. His dark cotton shirt was casually unbuttoned at the collar. His broad shoulders felt entirely free of the invisible, crushing armor he had worn as a heavy burden for 16 long years. The underground world was quiet. His enemies were buried in ash and forgotten dust. Down below in the private inner garden, a small, vibrant figure knelt softly on the emerald green grass. Little Lily wore a bright, cheerful yellow summer dress. She was carefully, meticulously placing a red wooden block on top of an impossibly tall, fragile tower. Her dark curls bounced with every cautious, deliberate movement. Beside her, Allie sat gracefully on a white marble garden bench. A soft, genuine, untroubled smile graced her lovely lips. The constant, gnawing terror of running had completely vanished from her dark eyes forever. The ghosts of a violent, merciless past were finally laid to rest in the dirt. The heavy wooden door directly behind Murphy clicked open softly. Light, silent footsteps crossed the pristine threshold. Allie walked into the sunlit suite, stopping just behind his broad shoulder. She reached out with a steady hand, resting her warm palm gently against his back. "She's been building that exact same tower for over 20 minutes, Allie murmured, her voice warm, melodic, and full of quiet joy. "It hasn't fallen once," Murphy replied, his deep voice carrying a rare, tender resonance. He turned around slowly to face her. His dark eyes held none of the lethal, freezing ice that used to terrify everyone who entered this room. Instead, they reflected a deep, immovable, oceanic warmth. "Because the foundation is unbreakable," Murphy whispered, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Allie looked straight up into his strong, carved face. She remembered the terrifying night she first walked through those heavy iron gates in absolute despair. She remembered the blood, the sudden fear, and the cold, dead eyes of a feared Mafia boss trapped inside his own self-made cage of isolation. "I never thought I could call a place home again in this lifetime," Allie confessed softly, her voice trembling with the weight of her relief. "You didn't just find a home, Allie," Murphy said, his strong fingers gently tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "You built one. With every single breath, and with every colored block you helped stack against the dark." From down in the courtyard garden, a small, excited, bell-like voice drifted up through the open window. "Big man, Mama, look!" Lily jumped up and down in the grass, pointing triumphantly upward at her towering creation. "Look, it touches the sky!" Murphy and Allie exchanged a quiet, knowing smile that said everything words never could. Murphy walked over to the wide balcony railing. He looked down at the little girl who had somehow managed to melt the coldest, hardest heart in the entire underworld. Then he looked out across his sprawling, secure empire, an empire no longer built on fear, intimidation, and blood, but on absolute protection and love. "Let's go down," Murphy said, extending his strong, open hand to Allie. Allie placed her smooth fingers securely inside his warm palm without a moment's hesitation. Together, they walked out of the bright master suite and down the grand marble staircase, hand in hand. The iron fortress had ceased to be a terrifying prison long ago. Today, it was a true sanctuary. And for the first time in his life, Murphy Moretti knew, with absolute certainty, that he had already won everything that truly mattered in this world. The golden sunlight cascaded over the courtyard tiles as they stepped out into the open air. The gentle morning breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the estate's eastern wall. Lily dropped her wooden block with a cheerful clatter and ran across the grass toward them. Her small arms reached out wide, her yellow dress fluttering like a butterfly in the light. Murphy knelt down instantly, opening his broad arms to catch her. He scooped her up effortlessly, spinning her around once as a burst of pure, unadulterated laughter escaped the child's lips. "Careful, little builder," Murphy rumbled playfully, setting her gently back on her feet. "My tower!" "Didn't break," Lily declared proudly, grabbing a corner of Murphy's dark sleeve. "I know it didn't," Allie said, kneeling down beside her daughter and adjusting the collar of her dress. "Because you built it with care." Murphy stood up, towering over them both, yet his presence no longer felt oppressive or terrifying. It felt like a mountain standing guard over a quiet valley. Mateo walked out from the side portico, holding a sleek leather folder tucked neatly under his arm. He paused a few paces away, a faint, respectful smile touching the corners of his scarred lips. "Morning, boss." "Morning, Mrs. Duca," Mateo greeted smoothly, using the name that had finally become reality. "Anything pressing?" Murphy asked, keeping one hand resting lightly on Allie's shoulder. "Nothing that can't wait," Mateo answered, shaking his head. "The ports are clear, the accounts are balanced, the city is quiet." "Then let it stay quiet," Murphy replied. "Yes, sir." Mateo offered a crisp nod and stepped back into the shadows of the colonnade, leaving the family to the morning's sun. Allie looked up at Murphy, her dark eyes shining with a quiet, profound realization. "You really did change everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the garden leaves. "The world didn't change, Allie," Murphy answered, looking down into her face with absolute devotion. "We just finally let the light in." Lily tugged urgently on Murphy's trousers, breaking their gaze. "Big man, come help me build a bigger one." Murphy let out a rare, deep chuckle that echoed warmly across the lawn. "Lead the way, builder," Murphy said, offering his hand to Lily while keeping his other arm around Allie. The three of them walked together toward the garden bench. The iron gates of the Duca estate remained wide open to the world. There was nothing left to fear. The war was over. The shadows were gone. And the sanctuary they had forged together stood stronger than any fortress ever built by man.